Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar, which is dedicated to the Syrian experience of the post-war reconstruction, humanitarian reconstruction, but also to transitional justice. We're glad that we have this opportunity to conduct this seminar with this webinar actually, with the support of Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union, USAID Human Rights and Action Program, and in a cooperation with the Global Rights Compliance. And this webinar, you can follow this webinar in English via Zoom, but also if you prefer Ukrainian language, Ukrainian interpretation, you can follow this webinar in Facebook on the Facebook page of Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union or Mission of the President of Ukraine in Crimea. We had approximately 180 people registered preliminary to this webinar, which is great, I think, because Syria is quite far from Ukraine, and Ukrainians usually are very much focused at ourselves. That's why it's kind of great that we have lots of people interested in this experience. I would like to make a disclaimer immediately that we do not try to compare conflicts, armed conflicts in Ukraine and in Syria. Our aim is a bit different, is to look actually how this country, Syria, is surviving, how it's surviving the not literally probably, but how it survives the next day after the conflict is over, when the war is over, what is happening with this country. And I would like to introduce our guests today. We have two prominent international lawyers with us. Please meet Ibrahim Olabi. He is a lawyer, a barrister at Guernica 37, International Justice Chambers in London. He is a founder of the Syrian Legal Development Program, an organization that works on human rights in Syria, particularly business crime. Ibrahim worked as a consultant for the UN and the International Bar Association on Syria-related matters. He studied at Manchester University and was awarded the Undergraduate and Postgraduate Student of the Year. Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. And Ibrahim joins us from London. Also, another speaker for today is Wayne Jordash. Probably lots of you may know him because he works in Ukraine from 2015. Wayne is a managing partner at the Global Rights Compliance. He has been engaged in working with business and civil society to ensure that reconstruction efforts in Syria are conducted with respect for human rights and in compliance with international humanitarian law standards. And he is currently working in Ukraine and deals with the various issues related to the war, which continues in Ukraine, in the territory of Ukraine, and therefore he can share with us his thoughts about how can this Syrian experience, so to say, be applied in Ukraine or be considered in Ukrainian context. I have to also say a bit about the format. So now I will give the floor first to Ibrahim and then to Wayne. And after, you can ask your questions and leave your comments on the Facebook page, on the Facebook pages, basically, where you can see the video. But also, if you're watching us, if you're following us in the Zoom room, you can also leave your comments or questions in the chat. Before proceeding with our guests, I would also like to mention the fact that the war in Syria continued for 9 years. That's a lot, and lots of damages are there. And of course, the damages in terms of how people suffered are also impressive. In particular, according to UNHCR, there are more than 5.5 million refugees in various countries around Syria. There are almost 6 million of internally displaced persons, according to OCHA. There are approximately 381,000 persons that were killed in the course of the civil war in Syria as of January 2020, according to Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. And now the country, according to the media which are reporting from the field, like Guardian and New York Times, currently the country is struggling with the poverty, with the hunger. Of course, there are also consequences of the COVID, although there are not so many people infected, but probably it's also the part of the problem is that there's a lack of testing in the country, which is obvious because of all these humanitarian reasons. And actually, probably there can be no successful humanitarian recovery in this country without the participation of the international community. And the international community is there to provide this assistance from the moment when the war considered to be over, although as far as I understand, it's a question whether it's over. So now I would like to give the floor to Ibrahim, and I would ask him to comment on few important and essential issues. First of all is the role of the international community in all this humanitarian story after the war. How active is the international community and how effective is the international community there? But also when it comes to transitional justice and the issue of responsibility, I think for Ukrainian people, for Ukrainian society, the issue of Russian involvement in this conflict is very important, not also because of the things which we're having in Ukraine, but also because as we know, at least as some of Ukrainian human rights groups like Crimean Human Rights Group reports, there are Ukrainian citizens that were conscripted to Russian army in Crimea. They are sent to Syria and they are fighting in Syria on behalf of the Russian government. So for us, it's important to understand whether Russian government, the Russia Federation, can be brought potentially to responsibility for their actions in Syria. How is it possible? Also, we would appreciate if you provide us with the information on your activities related to sanctions. I know that you advocate actively for the sanctions regarding probably Assad's government. So how successful is that? Whether international community is ready to impose the sanctions in the situation when the humanitarian crisis is in the place, and how complicated it is to advocate for these sanctions. And also one of the essential issues when it comes to transitional justice and to the responsibility are those proceedings, criminal proceedings, and those courts which are currently in place in EU countries regarding the citizens of European Union who participated in the Syrian war, but also some of the Assad's officials who are currently arrested and accused of committing the crimes against humanity, the tortures within the war. So could you please give us this broad picture of the humanitarian situation in your country and comment on those issues which I have mentioned?
With pleasure. Thank you so much, Maria, for inviting me and for organizing this. And thank you to all other organizers as well. It's always a pleasure to speak alongside Wayne on such topics. Perhaps it's important for me to start with setting the scene a little bit, because as you said, every conflict is different, and so it's important to try and lay some foundations. It's also important to lay those foundations because the Russia as a party to a conflict has also been actively trying to distort the narrative. And Ukraine is geographically closer to Russia than we are, and I'm assuming a lot of the propaganda that Russia has been trying to do around the world, in Europe, in the East, in the West, is also active in different parts of the world. So it's important to note that what's happening in Syria and the kind of crimes that took place is not, or the civilian casualties and the destruction is not a result of war, right? When we say X amount of people have died or Y amount of hospitals were destroyed, it gives it the impression as this was a brutal conflict, yes, but the parties to the conflict tried their utmost to uphold the laws of war and fight ethically, and they tried their best, but civilian casualties were inevitable, because this is war. The truth couldn't be further from what I just said. The Syrian conflict is characterized by the targeting of civilians, by the deliberate destruction of hospitals, by enforced disappearance, by torture, by sexual violence, by the commission of a wide range of systematic crimes from 2011 till now. And so it is important that people look up the Commission of Inquiry, for example. So the Human Rights Council created the Commission of Inquiry in 2011, and since then, almost every 6 months, it has been issuing report after report talking about the crimes that are being committed in Syria, right? And horrifying reports from all sorts of crimes that we're talking about. Tens of thousands of people remain detained. The other issue is that when we say crimes are being committed, or the Commission of Inquiry is reporting crimes or documenting crimes, it also gives the impression that all parties to the conflict have committed crimes. And while this is true, it's inaccurate. So the vast majority of the crimes were committed by the Syrian regime and its allies, which includes Russia. And trying to conflate, that doesn't mean that the other parties are innocent, of course not. And perhaps maybe if they had the ability, they would have done the same thing, but these are all assumptions. But the vast majority of the war crimes and the crimes against humanity and the death and the torture and the detention was at the hands of the government. And this is not me talking, this is again the UN Commission of Inquiry, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and a series of other credible international human rights organizations. And the problem is when we kind of conflate this truth and make it sound as if all parties committed to a conflict, it makes the question of accountability almost impossible, because we're not attributing the acts to the people who have committed them. It dilutes the water in that sense. Then you will hear a lot that a lot of countries are looking for a political solution for Syria, and that they are now trying to convene a constitutional committee. And again, that, in my opinion, is a dangerous slippery slope for the kind of narrative of the Syrian conflict, because it tries to frame it as if 400,000 Syrians were killed because of an article in a constitution, or that the Commission of Inquiry wrote a 504-page report about, a report which interviewed 504 Syrian women who were raped and sexually assaulted, and then the amount of sexual crimes committed against them, particularly by the Syrian regime, which has the majority of the pages attributed to it in that report, was done because they couldn't agree on a political matter like tax law or ministerial distributions or parliamentary or presidential systems. That is not the truth. The reason we're talking about a constitutional committee, and you'll see the envoy talking about constitutional committee and others, is that that's the only breakthrough that they managed to get the parties to of the conflict and their allies to talk about at the moment. But it's not the root cause of the problem, and it will definitely not solve the problem. And as you rightly said, Maria, we're not in a post-conflict phase. Even reconstruction and humanitarian aid, that I will talk to in a bit, is being used as a weapon. Usually when we talk about reconstruction or humanitarian aid, we're talking about humanitarian aid is during conflict and reconstruction is post-conflict. We talk about these norms as if the conflict is over. But in Syria, they're being weaponized. they are being used as a means and method of warfare in Syria against civilians who have political views against the government. And I'm going to outline this in a bit. And I know when you first approached me to kind of do this this presentation, you mentioned, you know, lessons learned and what sort of transferable issues could we raise to for our audience today to kind of benefit from. But I must say that we're still learning. I don't think we can say, I will share some things that we've learned that I hope is transferable, but it's still quite a learning process because the conflict is not yet over. So with this kind of grim introduction about the crimes that were committed in Syria and are kind of still ongoing, so the conflict has not calmed down. You know, militarily, in some areas it has, and with very fragile ceasefires, but we still have tens of thousands of people who are detained, arbitrarily detained, tortured, and enforcedly disappeared. And so that is one of the files that remains missing and not solved in the Syrian conflict. And therefore, you will find groups like Families for Freedom or Families Association of Victim Groups at the moment being very loud because they still have loved ones who they don't know anything about, not because they got missing because of a war. It's because the regime detained them and they no longer have any information about them. And we're talking tens of thousands of people documented by their first, middle, and last name. So no question there. So against this backdrop, let us look about how effective the humanitarian aid and reconstruction was. I'm not a humanitarian, so I will not, in the sense that I don't work in the humanitarian field, just to clarify. So in the sense, I'm not going to be able to talk about the numbers, how many people were benefited, the kind of billions that was spent. But what I can tell you is that last week, not even last week, yesterday, the Brussels conference for Syria ended, and there was a pledge of 7.7 billion US dollars for Syria in aid. And that is an amount less than previous years. So you can only imagine the amount of aid that is going into Syria. And the reason that amount is going into Syria is not particularly because the world cares about Syria out of, you know, a value-based interest, but because Syria, the spillover of the Syrian conflict, had impact on the entirety of the region, and I would say the world, particularly Europe, through the refugee crisis, through extremist groups, and through the proxy war that is ongoing. The conflict in Syria is not a Syrian conflict at all. It is being played on Syrian soil, but it's not a Syrian conflict. It is not even a Cold War anymore. It's the hottest as it gets between Russia and the US, Turkey, Iran, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, some North African countries as well. And we can see how this spillover is also becoming, we're getting a similar feature of that in Libya at the moment, where you're getting the same parties to the conflict, the proxies, sponsoring and supporting the groups there. So because the conflict in Syria is a proxy war, where states not only fund, but are also present physically with their military, it created this big interest where everyone and every state would like to say that we are funding, we're doing our bit. So yesterday, Brazil, I think, pitched 75,000. You know, it's a small amount, but it's still, they make it sound as if we want to do something. Germany, I think, was 1.3 billion. South Korea was, Lithuania was 50,000. So I'm just giving you an example that in that event, we had 82 ministerial level, a Ministry of Foreign Affairs attendants or their deputies speaking about Syria and pledging humanitarian aid as a way, in my opinion, to show that they're doing something about Syria to their own populations, but also to other states, and to kind of maintain some leverage. And although I'm not a specialist in the humanitarian field, from a human rights perspective, we've seen that humanitarian aid not only has been politicized, but also has been criminalized. So we had starvation, and I know GRC works closely on that. So issues of starvation in Syria, where people literally starved to death because aid was not allowed into their areas. 15 of those areas were encircled and besieged by the regime with the opposition. We had cross-border aid done without the authorization of the government with the Security Council resolution. And now that is a hot topic at the moment because they are trying to figure out whether they can continue this aid or not. And I think in 10 days' time, there's a vote in the Security Council whether they can still cross the Syrian border with that Security Council resolution for aid purposes without the consent of the regime, because the regime doesn't control that area. We have seen a targeting of hospitals of humanitarian aid. We have seen detention of medical workers. You might have heard about the white helmets and the first responders, which Russia talks about as a terrorist organization, but they're one of the most heroic groups on the ground that are saving lives and documenting the crimes that Russia is doing. And I had the pleasure of training some of them inside Syria. And I was actually inside Syria when one of the chemical attacks took place, training the white helmets on the illegality of chemical weapons, if you can just imagine the irony of that. And so you have a targeting of humanitarian aid, but states, when you kind of talk to Western countries about doing something, all what they say is that we pledge more aid. But pledging more aid does not solve the problem. Syria is not a problem of earthquakes and volcanoes. It is a man-made problem. It is political in the sense it's caused by political and military leaders, and therefore it can be only solved as such. Humanitarian aid does not solve it. But what we've also seen is that businesses who are linked to the financial support of human rights abuses of the government have been milking, and I mean milking, the humanitarian aid system through setting up companies, very legitimate companies, businesses that create, and sell bread, wheat, whatever the humanitarian need is. They can sell at half the price because they're large businesses with connection to the government. And then they are able to bid for these contracts from the UN and international organizations and use that money to support the government, which is committing a lot of abuses. And the organization that I run has looked into 490 different suppliers, and we've looked into them in a lot of more detail and investigated them, and we found a lot of them play a vital role, not in the war economy, because as I said, war arguably could be fought through legal means, but in the war crime economy. So they're not supporting a party to a conflict for that party to a conflict to find another combatant. They are facilitating torture centers, spying on civilians, think that kind of business support. And so the humanitarian imperative blinded some humanitarians from seeing the consequence, the human rights consequence of their action and not being able to mitigate it. Now, of course, no one is saying suspend aid, and no one is saying that food doesn't come before certain other rights. But that assessment of what harm am I doing from a human rights perspective when I'm delivering humanitarian aid or procuring, buying goods and services with hundreds of millions of dollars. You talked about the economy, Maria, it is crashing. And therefore, when the foreign aid comes in, am I benefiting the war crime economy or not? These were questions that are still not dealt with properly. And then if we're talking about reconstruction, so reconstruction is one of the most sensitive areas or topics in Syria at the moment. So on one hand, you have the Western powers, Europe, the US mainly, having a clear political stance and a clear red line saying that there will be no reconstruction funding without a political, genuine, inclusive political transition process solution to the Syrian conflict. On the other hand, you have countries like Russia who are jetting across the globe asking for donors to fund reconstruction because the amount of Russian companies that we have monitored that have set up local subsidiaries in Syria is shocking. And they know that they need that money. I mean, they've made enough money out of selling and testing their weapons on us in Syria. But now it is time to benefit those who supported the government. And so there's a lot of Russian companies, a lot of Russian business interest, but we know that Russia does not have the money to pay. So how is Russia playing that line? One word: refugees. What they're holding Europe at ransom, saying, if you give us money, we will reconstruct the country and refugees from Syria and the neighboring countries will return. Refugees from Europe who are Syrian. And there's 1 million Syrians in Europe everywhere. False. The World Bank came out and UNHCR came out and said the number one reason why or people will not be returning to Syria because of economical advantages. That might play a role. But the fear of torture, detention, forced conscription, arrest is the primary fear. And you can take Jordan as one example. You have hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees in Jordan. The south of Syria, which has borders with Jordan, is fully controlled by the government. Refugees are not returning. Why? West of Syria, borders with Lebanon. Lebanon has at least 1 million Syrian refugees. West of Syria is controlled by the army, by the Syrian government. No active hostilities, yet very low return. Why? Because as Human Rights Watch documented, those who are returning are being detained, arrested, and tortured. And so Russia is in a tricky place because on one hand, it needs the funds of reconstruction. On the other hand, it supported a regime that people will not return to Syria while it remains in power. That is quite clear. And there's a lot of assessments and surveys done on Syrians in Europe. So refugees are being used as a card to promote reconstruction. But reconstruction in Syria, the way it's being promoted, has severe human rights implications on housing, land, and property issues. Because these are areas that are being confiscated by civilians who opposed the government and left their land. So we have a lot of legal, quote unquote, legal legislation passed that allows the government to confiscate properties and land of Syrians and then offer that to reconstruction, such as Decree number 66 and Law number 10, and you could look those up. And therefore, because you have forced displacement, any sort of reconstruction would be used as a tool, as I said earlier, to further punish civilians, not combatants, who asked for their rights in 2011 when they took it to the streets. And that gets me to the second issue you asked me about sanctions. In 2000 and, well, it's been a couple of sanctions regimes, but there were ones in 2018 mainly. The EU listed individuals and entities, business entities, because they were linked to the expropriation of property in Syria by getting involved in a reconstruction project. Because they get that the word reconstruction, although sounds noble, confers a lot of right-based implications to the citizens, the original inhabitants of those lands. And then, therefore, sanctions have been used on Syria since 2011. But it's also a myth that sanctions, economic sanctions, and these are unilateral economic sanctions. So they're based, it's either EU sanctions or US sanctions, because there are no UN sanctions on Syria due to the Russian and Chinese veto. We're not, I mean, there were, a lot of them were imposed early on in the conflict, but Syria was under sanctioning in 2004 and 2008 because of its link to extremist groups in Iraq and things like that. So it's not a new thing that the Syrian regime has been dealing with. But the Syrian regime, Russia and Iran just yesterday in the ministerial conference, spoke very critically about these sanctions, saying that they impede humanitarian access. They are undermining the inability to deal with COVID-19 and other issues. And so this is a very tricky topic, because let us differentiate between two mechanisms. You have sectorial sanctions and targeted sanctions. And the sectorial, so those who target banks or oil or import and export of certain products, should be clearly distinguished from those who target that target individuals and entities. But the problem that you're having is that that economic tool seems to be the only power that the Europe and the West currently has against Syria. And so they're deploying it against perpetrators, yes, and against certain economic activity, legitimately targeting it, yes, but that obviously has an implication on the Syrian people. Because those who control the economy, and if you target the central bank, which has been, money laundering, but also is needed as the backbone of the economy, you will effectively harm the Syrian people one way or the other. So the choices around sanctions are very delicate, very difficult, but it seems to be annoying the perpetrators greatly and holding them to account while there are effects on civilians. So these effects need to be mitigated through humanitarian exemptions and other ways. And sanctions need to be used as a policy tool, not a policy. So the EU and the West should not sit back and say, we're going to sanction Syria and do nothing else. Because sanctioning a regime and a country never got us anywhere without any specific action. And therefore...
excuse me, Ibrahim, sorry for interrupting you. Since sanctions are extremely important issue for our context, I have to ask you to speak a little bit slowly, because our interpreter cannot do it so fast. And we have lots of people watching us in the Facebook and they need the translation. Sorry, sure. Thank you.
Sorry, no, sorry about that. Can you just give me a 5-minute mark, Maria, whenever I'm getting to the 5-minute mark?
Sure, you have.
So sanctions by the EU and the US have been a powerful tool. But you need to know that they're a double-edged sword, because our organization was not able to open a bank account in the UK, and I'm a UK lawyer, because we have Syria in our name. Banks don't want to do anything with Syria anymore because it is sanctioned, and let alone other entities and governments and things like that. So it is not a topic that you can advocate on easily. And when Syrian organizations, because we work a lot on sanctions, we said we need a position on this. And the shortest position we could adopt on sanctions was 5 pages long. The other side has a quick solution. Russia says, lift sanctions. But that is not the solution either. And sanctions have been used in Syria as an interim accountability measure. So because there is no referral to the International Criminal Court due to the Russian veto, and because there are no reliable court systems in Syria, in fact, the court system in Syria was weaponized as well to torture people and forcibly contribute to their enforced disappearance. Sanctions were used as a tool to put pressure. But we always say that this is an interim solution. And we were very happy to see some cases now, such as those that you kind of mentioned. In Europe, particularly Germany. Germany is leading through universal jurisdiction by issuing arrest warrants against perpetrators of the regime who committed mass crimes against the Syrian people. Now, these trials are not an alternative to a proper mechanism, but at least they sent the message that no normalization will be done with this regime that has committed any crimes. And that also fits into the narrative of Reconstruction, because I don't think the regime cares about the reconstruction of Syria. What they care about is legitimacy. Because with reconstruction, you need a partner. You need the government to be your partner in this. And so with the political blockage on reconstruction, the government is unable to get that. And with these cases happening in Europe, they're being used as a signal that this government should never be a partner in reconstruction. And in my opinion, as a lesson learned from that, when you work on accountability anywhere, you should ensure that the way you define accountability is wide enough to go beyond your court-based procedures. So what, if you're looking at it from what hurts kind of thing, or how do I hold this perpetrator to account? It might not be courts. It might be economic matters, denying them contracts, denying them legitimacy. And we know that the Syrian government strives for legitimacy in appearing to be a state. They interact at the UN. They hold speeches. They enter into treaties, quote unquote treaties, with territories like Crimea. The Syrian government has received political delegations from Crimea and sent ones as well, and entered into economic relations. That is sending a political message around reconstruction, not a financial one. And so being able to identify what are the consequences that affects that perpetrator of crimes the most, and using that to hold them to account is key. And that might be court-based processes, and it might be something completely different. So that would be my first kind of lesson learned of widening what accountability should mean. The other thing is that ensure that you're in there for the long term, the long battle. Perpetrators of crimes, particularly states, depend on people and activists dying out, tiring, not being able to stay in there for the long term, having huge expectations about justice that we'll never be able to achieve. We know in Syria that there is no such thing as justice. There isn't. How could you get someone's dad back who was tortured? How can you get 10 years of being imprisoned back? Who can give you back, anything after you get sexually assaulted and raped? There is no such thing as justice, or as full justice. But what we can do is make that a verb: fighting impunity, promoting human rights, building the strength of capacity of human rights defenders, making it more difficult for perpetrators to get away with it. These things is what we can do. And these things are the things that we need to continue doing in the long term. Another lesson learned is do not undermine the importance of the narrative. Because what a mistake that Syrians did, and I admit that, is that we in around 2013, 2014 said, oh, everybody knows what's happening in Syria. And that sentence was a disaster, because the propaganda machine, the Twitter trolls, that the electronic armies that Russia pays for, works very hard in distorting the narrative. And when you have a distorted narrative, it becomes the Syrian conflict. It becomes the war in Syria. Refugees fled war, not persecution, not torture. You talk about post-conflict, and you talk about all parties to the conflict. And you cannot push towards accountability if you have a distorted narrative. So educating people, the public, my own kind of compass were taxi drivers in London. When I speak to taxi drivers and they ask me where I'm from and I say Syria, I could see the shift in narrative between 2012 and 2018. I would have also said barber shops, but they're closed at the moment, as you can clearly see. So all these people, the barbers, the taxi drivers, the ordinary people who would usually say, oh, what's happening in Syria is horrible, and that regime is killing its own people. At best, they now say, I don't know what's happening in Syria. It's too complicated. And that makes the battle for accountability and the fight against impunity even more difficult and even more of an uphill battle. So don't undermine speaking to people. Don't undermine Facebook or Twitter. We left Facebook. We had a word for those who just stayed on Facebook in Syria as the Facebook revolutionaries, as a bad word, you know, that you're not doing anything and you're just sharing what's happening on Facebook. And when we left that front, and I say it's a front, Russia picked it up. And we started seeing things in the comment section. You know, they'd go to a Guardian article about Syria and the crimes, and they go to the comment section, which, you know, people go to now to see the other view, right? Because that's now how what the public reaction is to this mainstream media. And they see that, oh, what the Guardian is saying is lies, blah, blah, blah. And they got all their kind of Twitter accounts, Facebook accounts to like it. It goes to the top. You start doubting the truth. And that makes it impossible to convince prosecutors, to convince politicians to take any action, because why would they? The British public, the European public, the American public are confused about Syria. I'd finish off by saying, appeal to interests of these states, not to their values. We did a mistake in Syria, believing in humanitarian and human rights red lines, thinking that when the West or the world would say, we will not allow, I don't know, or never again is the word, that's the hashtag that they used, making references to other previous conflicts. That did not materialize. Countries care about their interests. People care about their interests. And think of countries as people. Think of aid agencies as people. Do not let the UN get away of being under the UN. It's not the UN. It's people, individuals, that are able to do that change. So appeal to the individual. Appeal to their interests. And that might be a human rights perspective. That they might genuinely believe that. But they might also genuinely not. And so be careful with that. And my final point is that all the conflicts we're talking about, Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Yemen, that we're talking about today, are all interconnected with the same players. And I'm truly humbled and happy that I got this invitation to speak to a completely different audience today. Because I think our battles for human rights in this kind of growingly scary world should not be fought on one front. Russia is in Syria, in Libya, and in Eastern Ukraine. And therefore, in order for us to be able to work together on these matters, we need to collaborate. We need to see our causes as different, but as interlinked. And that's an open invitation to anyone who's listening today to see how we can collaborate on these very vital human rights matters. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for this impressive presentation. It was indeed impressive, I have to say. And also what is interesting that there are some lessons that we can learn from Syria, definitely. And there are some things which are just identical. When you were mentioning this illusion that everybody knows what's going on in your country, we have the same illusion in Ukraine. People think that everyone understands what is going on, what's the role of Russian Federation in the war, but it appears to be that it's not so obvious. And all these issues related to the distorted narrative, it's completely relevant for Ukraine. But what is also interesting is for instance, the role of Germany. And I'm really happy that Germany uses this universal jurisdiction principles against people who are allegedly involved in crimes against humanity, in tortures. But at the same time, with the other hand, Germany is supporting Nord Stream 2, which is very beneficiary for the Russian Federation, and it's very controversial, at least from my point of view. So the situation here is very complicated, at least. Now, let me give the floor to Wayne Jordash. And Wayne, if you can, please comment on the dilemma which we were discussing with you previously before this webinar. I mean, the dilemma between humanitarian issues which we're facing after the war, after the conflict, and the justice and the accountability. Why this dilemma is there in Syria, and whether Ukraine can face something similar in the future. And also, what are the lessons of Syrian, this post-war, but not actually post-war period for Ukraine? What are the main things that we have to learn and to consider for our future?
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you, Ibrahim, for what was a fascinating insight into the Syrian situation. What I would start with, because I think this is perhaps the most obvious thing that jumped out at me listening to Ibrahim, was his regret at, to some extent, assuming or allowing the assumption to live that somehow everybody knew what was going on in Syria, and somehow there'd be a consensus around that, and somehow that would lead to a human rights response, or a response which was useful in terms of protecting lives and protecting the communities there. And I think those questions, I think, are really looming large in Ukraine. And I've seen that since working here since 2015. If we step back a moment and look at what transitional justice is, of course, there's the question of whether transitional justice should begin during a conflict or it's something that happens afterwards. I think the general view is that we start transitional justice as soon as we can. Transitional justice is the full range of processes and mechanisms which allow a society to come to terms with its legacy of past abuses, ensuring accountability, serving justice, achieving reconciliation. It's a complex and multi-layered issue. It involves, as we know, criminal prosecutions, truth-seeking mechanisms, amnesties, institutional reforms, reparation programs. And we all know that, that's what transitional justice is. But actually, the most important part of that, none of it means anything unless it's based, unless the mechanisms, unless the transitional justice strategy is based on truth. Prosecutions are obvious, they must be based on truth. Amnesties, reparation programs, who suffered, who needs redress, obviously based on truth. Institutional reforms must be based on an accurate description of what the problem was, what the harm was, who are the victims, who are the perpetrators. And I think looking at Ukraine's situation over the last few years, I think, unfortunately, there's an approach to the truth which I think is more political than it is actual. The average person, I suspect, in Ukraine believes that Russia is in occupation in Crimea and Russia is in occupation in Donbass. They may well be right. That may be true. But has the necessary work been done to establish that as a matter of fact, as in a matter of international law? If you look at domestically, it's assumed, in fact. Ukraine has not, in fact, bottomed out those issues and fully demonstrated those issues. Now, I'll come to what Ukraine has done, and Ukraine has been quite impressive in many respects in trying to ensure that the truth prevails. But it's a very serious and threatening moment for Ukraine, because if you look internationally, those presumptions are not necessarily shared at the international level. Yes, there is almost overwhelming consensus that Russia is in occupation in Crimea. Russia will claim, of course, that sovereignty is transferred to Russia. The people there exercised self-determination, and they now are the sovereign power. Internationally, that is not accepted. But then move to the east, to Donbass, and the situation is much more complicated. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe will refer to Donbass has been occupied, in that sense, occupied by Russia. That means they have concluded that Russia is in overall control of the armed groups there. But that is not a view that is certainly shared, or certainly not expressed by the UN. It's not a view that is certainly expressed by the OSCE. It's not a view that, in fact, has been demonstrated through careful assessment of the facts and application of international law. And it's a problem. And it's a problem for the reasons that Ibrahim outlined in relation to Syria. Now, what Ukraine has done in relation to that, these issues, is impressive in the sense that it has used international courts to try to establish the truth in relation to a number of issues which are important in terms of establishing truth, whether that's interacting with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which will look at the crimes which have been committed in Crimea and Donbass, whether that's using the International Court of Justice to look at the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in Crimea, or the Convention on the Financing of Terrorism in Donbass. But of course, as impressive as those efforts are, due to the jurisdiction of the courts, truth that will come out of those courts, not only will it be a long-term project, the ICC, for example, will not be considering these issues for at least another 7 to 10 years before we get a definitive description of the international legal regime applicable to Crimea and the international legal regime applicable in Donbass, and the crimes and the violations that have occurred at the behest of Russian officials. So we're waiting a long time. They're restrained, these efforts, by the narrow jurisdiction of some of the questions. For example, with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, it was only possible for Ukraine to use the two conventions I've just mentioned. So necessarily the factual and the legal assessments will be narrow. So as impressive as those efforts have been, we are a long way in Ukraine from anything approaching a comprehensive approach to transitional justice, which must begin with establishing the truth. And it's not easy. It's actually very challenging for the reasons I've stated, but also because of various other reasons. One, the conflict is ongoing. Two, Russia is a formidable enemy, well-schooled at misinformation, denial, and obfuscation. Ukraine doesn't have access to Crimea. It doesn't have access to Donbass. These are significant obstacles in terms of being able to establish what in fact is happening and who in fact is responsible. In relation to criminal prosecutions nationally, how do you prosecute? How do you find the truth through prosecutions if you cannot access the territory, if you cannot get hold of suspects? And so Ukraine speaks of transitional justice. Civil society does some impressive work trying to nail down the issues. The government does some impressive work using the international legal instruments, but still it falls short on establishing truth, an essential platform to be able to move to transitional justice. And when I say transitional justice, truth leading to recognition of responsibility, recognition of harm, reparation of that harm, and institutional reform. Now, of course, Ukraine, I think, I think Maria said at the beginning, we're not here to compare Syria and Ukraine, but Ukraine does have certain benefits despite the horrors of the war in the East and despite the takeover of Crimea. And that's the benefit of a democratic process, however imperfect or perfect it is at this moment. Reform is taking place. Reform of institutions is taking place. And it's important, I think, and I think Ibrahim would agree with this, whatever the blame that is attributed to the government, whatever blame is attributed to Russia, it's important that Ukraine also does some self-analysis. Why did we get to a situation where Russia is able to interfere with Ukraine's sovereignty? And of course, I think the present government under Zelensky is addressing some of those issues, and the previous government also, looking at the reform of the institutions, looking at reform of the judiciary, looking at reform of trade, looking at reform of human rights regimes. These are all important, number one, because they address questions of truth, fairness, and equality. But number two, because they are fundamental to any viable, enduring transitional justice plan. So I can see significant similarities in respect of the pressing need for Ukraine to maintain the pressure and discovery of the truth. It is, as I say, not enough for Ukraine to assume that its political presumptions about Russia's conduct, Russia's misbehavior, Russia's violations of international law are shared on the international level. It's important that the facts are laid out for Ukrainian civilians and for the affected communities and for long-standing historical record, but it's equally important that that is done so that Ukraine can lobby at the international level to ensure that repressive measures are maintained upon Russia, and so that sovereignty pursuant or in relation to Crimea is not hidden by Russia's misinformation, and so that we understand exactly what's happening in the East and respond to it in a way which reflects the truth rather than what politically might be at some point convenient or not. As I say, it's a complicated issue, but I think where Syria and Ukraine really are similar is Russia has been successful at muddying the waters, at hiding its involvement. I think with Syria and Ukraine, only those really who are specialists, who are really understanding and working on these subjects, perhaps have a firm grip of what Russia's role is. And as I say, in my view, that is not enough for an enduring transitional justice or a fair and equitable response to the harms that have been caused. I don't know if that answers your questions, Maria.
Thank you, Wayne, for these important notes. I would like again to ask the audience to ask your questions and to leave your comments. And before we proceed to some of the comments and questions, I have also two questions to our speakers. And I will start with the first one, which is, which may sound naive for you as for the lawyers, but still, from my perception, it's, as a human rights activist and journalist, it's important. So when we're speaking about this complicated warfare, which is used by the Russian Federation in particular, when we're speaking about this so-called hybrid war, unconventional war, is the international legal architecture, if I may say so, can deal with this hybrid warfare and deal effectively, whether it can understand who is responsible for what, and not to perceive it very straight and forward, but to consider some wise approach to hold this hybrid warfare. So is there any potential for that? Because when it comes to Donbass, of course, Russian aim is that this armed conflict should be perceived by the international community as a civil war, so-called, right? Mm-hmm. So, and to be honest, when it comes to the field, and when you look at the facts which are in the field, there's not so much evidence of Russian presence there. So they, of course, they hide all these traces very carefully. So is international legal architecture able to identify those responsible for the international crimes in these extremely complicated conflicts of nowadays?
Should I go first, Ibrahim, and then you answer this after me?
I wouldn't dare go first, Wayne. This is your area.
Well, what I would say is this, that I mean, I'm going to sound very pessimistic or very negative, but you know, the truth is that the international legal system struggles with dealing with conventional conflicts. Ukraine, as I said, has, I think, admirably engaged with pretty much all the international legal mechanisms that it can. I mentioned some of them, but there's also the European Court of Human Rights. There's also proceedings that they've taken in relation to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. They have, I think, really done what they can do in terms of engaging the mechanisms. I'm not commenting on how they've done it, but I think what they've done is they've used the mechanisms that have been there. The problem is, of course, is that, you know, the mechanisms can only do so much. I mean, let me just use the International Criminal Court as an example. You know, Ukraine filed its declarations in 2014, which gave the court jurisdiction to conduct for the prosecution to conduct a preliminary examination. A preliminary examination will be followed by a full investigation if the court agrees with the prosecution that there's sufficient evidence, which it's very, very, very likely to do. I'd be very surprised if the International Criminal Court didn't find that there was a basis for a full investigation. But we are 5 years on, or 6 years on, and we still don't have an application or a conclusion by the prosecution that a full investigation is justified. And when that happens, as I think it will, and if the court agrees, which I think it will, you're then talking about another 2, 3, 4 years for a full investigation. So even before you get to the point of identifying, or before the prosecution gets to the point of identifying individuals who are suspected of committing conventional crimes, or through conventional warfare have committed international crimes, we're talking about another 3 years. And let's say you can get hold of the Russian suspects, you're then talking about another 3-4 years before they can be, the trials start. Trials at the ICC take on average around 9 years to complete. So I use the ICC because it's a good example of how the international legal mechanisms are limited in what they can do, even in relation to conventional warfare. Now, in relation to hybrid warfare, I think the world is just beginning to understand what that means. People use that term in Ukraine a lot, hybrid warfare, but I'm not sure that, again, has Ukraine done the necessary assessment to pin down what, in fact, they say Russia is doing, which amounts to hybrid warfare? We know it's misinformation. We know it's a mixture of conventional warfare. We know it's a mixture of supporting armed groups under the table and so on. But has Ukraine done that assessment? Certainly, it is not going to be done by an international court. They're not going to look at the hybrid warfare, because that's not what the international mechanisms do. The hybrid warfare may come in to, as a consideration. For example, if asking the question whether Russia is in control of the east of Ukraine, part of that question may well involve, does Russia control the armed groups through propaganda, through hybrid warfare, which is propaganda? But it's not going to be the center of the assessments conducted by the international mechanisms. If Ukraine is going to get some type of satisfaction for Russia's hybrid warfare, it will need to do the hard work of assessment, nailing down what has happened and making sure that the international community is aware of the full extent of that hybrid warfare.
Thank you, Wayne. Any comments from Ibrahim?
I fully agree with what Wayne has said. If I can perhaps add a few things from the Syrian context. I mean, when we talk about international law, there are so many different things, right? And we need to make sure not to conflate the facts with the law. So being able to assess what's happening and being able to document what's happening against the legal system or with the kind of framework of a legal system is one thing, and then that legal system actually working and producing results is another. So in the context of Syria, we do have international laws about attribution and aiding and abetting when it comes to the actual crimes and things like that, and our links are drawn to Russia, and no longer just as an actor that is supporting, but an actor that is actually doing. It's the actor that's actually committing those crimes. The New York Times did an incredible piece about how Russia is targeting the hospitals in Syria using Russian planes. So we're no longer talking about aiding and abetting in this sense. But that legal framework of international humanitarian law is not being mirrored through other legal systems that are supposed to hold these violations to account. And that is because there's simply no political will to hold these perpetrators to account, because the more states that get involved, now in Syria, you have the US present, you have Turkey present, you have Russia present. I mean, there are talks of French and British advisors in some places. You have the Lebanese militias there, you have Iranian militia there. It dilutes the water. Accountability against whom and for what? You know what I mean? And I think that is what Syria played with. The regime knew it could not survive the legal system or survive or be able to be held to account using the international legal system if it doesn't overcomplicate it and overburden it. And so instead of hiding the crimes, they're public. They don't necessarily deny what is happening in that way. They say they're terrorists, blah blah blah, these things, but the crimes are there. They're well documented. But they realize at some point that the best way to make this to get away with it is to make the legal system unable to decide what to go for, how to go for, what to decide. And then that dilutes the political will. And instead we just, let's go back and go to Geneva and talk about peace.
Thank you, Ibrahim. We have few questions from the audience. One of the comments is about the similarities of the perception by the West of the war in Syria and Ukraine. Another question is about whether there were some submissions from the victims of the human rights violations to European Court for Human Rights. I have to remind that Syria is not a member of Council of Europe, and the jurisdiction of the court is not extended to Syria. But maybe, Ibrahim, you can comment here about how did you manage to get Germany on board in terms of the universal jurisdiction, whose efforts were put in order to do that, because it's not so easy. We know that because we were trying to advocate for similar stuff related to Ukraine, and we were trying to find the ways of applying the universal jurisdiction towards the war in Ukraine, but we did not succeed. I do understand that you need to have really very strong political will in order to do that. So how it happened?
You did not succeed yet, Maria. Let's just add that, because it's a long fight and a long battle. So just quickly on Russia, there are now attempts to see what we can do with the Russian crimes in Syria. So Syria is not party, but Russia is to the convention, and we might be able to do something if we can find a strong jurisdictional link about Russia's involvement in Syria. But with Germany, so with Germany, there are a lot of, first of all, you have 800,000 Syrians in Germany as refugees, right? It's a huge number. Merkel took a big political risk, which cost her a lot of seats in the next elections by accepting that big of a number. That number plays a big role in when it comes to issues like return of refugees, for example, or for them to see that the country that's hosting them is doing something about justice, so that they don't become extreme or anything, or take matters into their own hand. So I think that amount of people played a big role. The second thing is that you have a lot of active Syrian NGOs that sought refuge in Germany, set up their organization there, and started victim groups and victim associations. Then you had German NGOs who assisted these victim groups and worked with them on this matter. And then you had the victims themselves who made the complaint to the police, because anyone can make a complaint to the police. This is not a difficult matter. The question is, would the prosecutor pick it up, and justify taxpayer money on something that, and I know this from the UK, and I probably Wayne would agree, is not statistically viable. You will not lock up someone with this trial, because they're all arrest warrants, mostly against people who are not in Germany, unless other than the last two cases. But you're getting a European arrest warrant against them. So if I'm a prosecutor and I need to fit a certain statistic about how many people I've charged and how many people I've been able to successfully lock up, these cases are not attractive. And that's where public interest comes into play. Is there enough public interest for the prosecutor to take this matter forward? And matters like the two arrest warrants that came up were for one or two of the most senior Syrian staff of the army and the intelligence, the second people after the president. And I know that these people, in order to charge or to try and get an arrest warrant against these people, the prosecutor needed approval from the highest German authority. Because this is a matter of this is diplomacy and political will, because in another context, Germany might not want to pick a fight with Syria on these issues. But in this case, it decided it will. But there's a lot of factors that played into that.
Okay. Thank you. Another question is about the practice. It's a legal question, actually, about the practice of the Namibia exceptions, so-called practice of Namibian exceptions, and whether it's applied in Syria. It means that whether there is a recognition of the documents about the birth and death and marriages, for instance, that are issued on the territory which is out of the control of the government, how these issues are solved when it comes to the territories which are under the control of different groups in various times.
Is that a question for me?
Yes, probably, if you're aware about this sort of things.
So I'm not aware of the practices themselves. Civil status documentation and the civil side of the conflict is not an area that I particularly focus on. My colleagues do. But this is a big problem in Syria, because what you had is, see, it's quite complicated, because what happened is that the Syrian regime and the government never saw itself or presented itself to the Syrian people as the government. It presented itself as the state. And when the uprising started in 2011, people no longer distinguished between the government and the state, because the courts were manipulated, the police was used, there's no separation of powers. And one of the things that I think was not done properly is to overly associate the Syrian law with the government. And so what you had in areas that were no longer under control of the government is people refusing to use Syrian law, because for 40 years, the government has manipulated these laws against them. But that said, there are a lot of good laws within them, like these civil registration laws. Civil registration laws in Syria have a lot of problems against Kurdish minorities and a lot of issues associated to them. But at least it's a starting point for you to use. So there has been vacuums in places where people were no longer able to, have marriage certificates, death certificates, birth certificates, who could be potentially stateless. And that is a big issue. Then you had people who started adopting other practices like Turkish law, because it's the neighboring country, to start using that. Then they started to use something that was never adopted, which is the Arab, Unified Arab Code. And so that because of their association of the Syrian law with the Syrian government, right? And that created a problem, not just for the Syrians who were born or died or got married during this period, but because you also had ISIS fighters come into Syria for 4 or 5 years, European, Western, Eastern, wherever they're from, got married to Syrian women, had a lot of children, and died in conflict. And these people, now these children, who are now 4, 5, 6, and estimates to say there's about 30,000 stateless, without document, children without documents in Syria, is a scary figure, because that could be a lost generation. Now, some countries like the UK did take children, UK by either father or mother, who were born in Syria back, some of them, but that's the starting point. But absolutely, the person who asked the question is spot on. This is a huge problem that we will have to deal with in the coming time, because that affects your ability to vote, your ability to, if there is an election that might happen in Syria at some point, all these people who do not have documents might be excluded. And that is a tactic.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for these details. Another question, which is, I would say, quite philosophical. So Anastasia Donets is asking, what is the point of international advocacy if, as both speakers noted, the politicians, lawyers, decision makers are aware of what is going on in both the occupied Ukrainian territories and Syria, but choose things like Nord Stream 2 and Russian annual payments to the Council of Europe? What are the alternatives, basically, if there are some? I think it's the question to both speakers.
Just to clarify, if they're aware of, if international decision makers are aware of?
What's the point in the international advocacy, in the classical one, if everyone knows everything, but still they support the Nord Stream 2, they support the comeback of Russian delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe. So it seems like this traditional advocacy does not work anymore. So what can be the alternative? And maybe also it refers to the call of Ibrahim to cooperate. So I fully share that call, and let's cooperate, but how we can do that? Maybe you have some particular ideas that can be accepted and developed by Ukrainian civil society, which is watching us now.
Well, I would say I'm an optimist. I don't share the view that international advocacy doesn't work. I think if you look at the international justice mechanisms we have now and compare them to what we had even 30 years ago, but especially 50 or 60 years ago, I would much rather be here than there in the past. So I don't share the view that international advocacy doesn't have an impact, but I do pick up what Ibrahim said about it's the long game. We cannot be idealistic human rights activists or idealistic citizens and look to an international court or an international organization like the Council of Europe and expect that they will give us the answers we want. It's a long game, and it requires endurance and stamina, and it requires civil society activism, and it requires civil society to engage with interested government, even if they're individuals within government. I think, you know, the likes of Putin, the likes of even leaders like Trump, what they do much better than what we do, i.e. when I say we, I mean progressive society which wants systems which run on human rights principles. They're much more ruthless, they're much more organized, they're much more determined. And I think we need to be the same, and we need to maintain pressure. You know, there are many things which the Ukraine government can do, which it hasn't done. And I mentioned some of them in terms of establishing truth. Who knows what would have happened if the Ukrainian government in Poroshenko's time had joined hands with civil society and conducted the analysis that I think is necessary to establish exactly what Russia's role is in the East and what exactly Russia's status is in Crimea. We can't be surprised if the politics of the day change, because it's in the hands of the politicians who have not been given the requisite tools, the requisite truth, which they have to confront and then are more likely to have to act on. You know, we have to take responsibility for failing to do that. And I think that's the point of legal advocacy. It needs to be smarter, it needs to be more determined, and it needs to establish the truth. And then I think we'll see better outcomes at the political level, but not necessarily ideal outcomes.
Ibrahim, are you still remaining an idealist?
I wouldn't say I ever had kind of an ideal view of what could happen, and Syria definitely taught me that. But what I firmly believe in is that the biggest war criminals, the kind of most brutal perpetrators, depend on us reaching one point where we sit back and say, what is the point? Because at that point, we've given up. And at that point, we've given them an easy way out. I always say we have two options. Either we make it easier for criminals or make it difficult for more criminals. I might not be able to hold them to account or change the course, but I will not let them easily get away with it. If they want to go forward with what they're doing, it will be difficult. So giving up, feeling depressed is or feeling that there's nothing that can be done, that is exactly the state that they want us to reach. And at that point, it's important to, in order not to reach that point, to have very clear expectations. Manage our own expectations. I've been working on Syria, and I'm Syrian, and I have family in Syria, and I've been to Syria. And I've witnessed the craziest things. I've been to Aleppo, I've been to Idlib, I've been to a lot of places. I've lost family members, friends, a lot of things. But I know that, there is no ideal solution to Syria. I remind myself of the good that I'm able to do, and what am I able to do more in small baby steps. When we train people, when we build their capacity, we're creating more advocates, more activists that are joining side by side in this cause. When we talk about disinformation, when we expose misinformation and propaganda, when we try to get people listed, when some people are held to account through court, that is better than doing nothing. And I don't want it, at least from my conscious point of view, that a time comes that I say, oh, what have I done? And I think it's important to remember that politics, so far, is made by people, not computers, right? Everything is being automated. But we're dealing with people. And politics and people change. Interests change. Sides change. And as long as we're able to lobby, advocate, discuss, influence those people, we can then shape their policies. But it's important to understand their interests, understand what am I after, what am I able to achieve, and not have super ideal views of what could happen, because that would only make us feel that we were not successful and just take a step back. No one can solve Syria. Not Putin, not Trump, not Europe, definitely not me. And therefore, it's not a matter of what has happened to Syria. It is a matter of what have I done.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. And we're running out of time. So I have to thank our speakers for your impressive presentations indeed, and for very important notes for Ukrainian society, but I believe also for the international community. And let us indeed cooperate somehow. I still don't know the exact way of cooperation, but we definitely can do that, because there should be no impunity when it comes to the war crimes and crimes against humanity, no matter where these crimes are committed, in the eastern Ukraine or in Syria, and even if they are committed without insania. So thank you so much for participating. Thanks to our audience, and special thanks to our technical team and to Anna, which provided the simultaneous interpretation. Thank you so much, and hopefully we can continue this practice of the webinars related to Syria, but also to the other hotspots on our planet. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.